Yes.
Can we turn, first of all, to a document, HSOC 303349, and it's page 7. So this is, I'm about to show you the terms of reference for the Ross group, the expert group.
Okay.
So if we can just look at that, the terms of reference for our group: to consider circumstances in which a system of financial and other support might be available to people who have been harmed by NHS treatment in Scotland in circumstances where there is unlikely to be liability on the part of NHS Scotland, and to apply general principles which are consistent, equitable and transparent for all. The situation of patients who have contracted HIV and or hepatitis C from blood transfusion or treatment with blood products should form part of the wider considerations. So that's the context in which the question is asked, and the question is this: was the hope that by viewing the blood contamination issue within the general no-fault compensation scheme, the group would rule out payments to the latter because of the precedent issue?
I don't think we were certain that that would be the case. I suppose we didn't really know what the conclusion was going to be. We were hoping that the second bullet point there could be with reference to the first bullet point. I mean, we talked about that quite extensively. We hoped that we could have a general equitable framework, and then we could, it's possible, I suppose, that within that framework, hepatitis C would have been either eligible or ineligible, but it was really all very open-ended. I mean, I think there were probably one or two people in the Scottish Executive that weren't happy about the expert group because, of course, what transpired was no doubt predicted by them, that it would come up with recommendations for large payments that we weren't at that time minded to give. So it was really quite open-ended. So I don't think there was any assumption built into those particular bullet points as far as I would recollect.
Now, casting your mind back now to December 2002, were you considering at that stage making regular payments as part of a scheme?
We were considering that was really the position. I mean, the turning point from regular payments, I think, was was a letter, or I think it was a letter to Andrew Smith, from memory, about the 18th of December, when we made the shift from the regular payment scenario to the lump sum scenario, and we did that on that because we were advised that got round the problem with reserved devolved powers. But as I've also explained, in a way, I was quite happy for other reasons. But yes, it depends what part of December you're talking about. Up till the 18th of December, and certainly including the committee meeting on the 11th of December, we were talking more about regular payments rather than lump sum payments.
So, sorry, I'm just trying to find my chronology, which I've now lost. But there is a letter from to Mr. Smith, WITN 6942015. Is this the letter you were talking about?
No, that's the earlier letter. So this is the letter which is really, from memory, it's asking about both the devolved powers issue and the social security implications. But the second letter, I think, was the 18th of December, which it was when we made the shift and said we've been advised, although we haven't been keen on lump sum payments up to now because it looks more like compensation, I'm saying from memory, but we've been advised that this is more likely to be allowable under the devolution setup, and therefore it was raising that issue. I think it was the 18th of December to Andrew Smith, which was a slightly different one.
Yes,
this one was asking both about the devolved powers issue and I think the social security knock-on effects.
So as we got this on screen, I've got some questions in relation to this letter, and then I've found the reference to the 18th of December letter as well, so we can put that up on screen. So if we look, yes, at this letter, so this is 5th of November 2002, financial compensation for victims of hepatitis C, social security implications. If we can turn over to the second page, the question is in relation to what's on the second page. And you say there, we have not taken any definite decision, but the scheme that currently looks the most attractive might involve, I think that must say, the outlay of between £1 and £4 million per annum, reflecting the wide range of uncertainty about the medical prognosis for the individuals involved. We would expect the average monthly payment to the individuals under the scheme to be in the order of £500 per month. And the question is in two parts. First of all, what was the basis of the analysis of making £500 regular monthly payments?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, because that obviously was not a proposal that we subsequently developed. So it was just to give him some rough guidance, in a sense, in terms of this letter. That really, some didn't matter. It was the principle that we were talking to him about. So as you can see, that is not, in terms of the money that we eventually put up, that is actually a comparatively small overall sum of money for the following year, between 1 and 4 million, when of course we were into double figures in terms of what we ultimately proposed for the following year. So I don't really know how the 1 and 4 million and the 500 related to each other, because, as I said, they were almost notional figures for the purposes of making the point about whether the issue was either devolved or whether he would cooperate on the social security issue, because £500 per month wouldn't have been much use to people if they'd lost some nearly equivalent amount or even lesser amount in benefits.
And the next part of the question, and it may be that you can't answer this, but did you have an idea at that stage as to who would be receiving these payments of £500 a month?
Well, all I know is that it was a limited number of people, because that was really the key assumption in November and December 2002, which was making me feel increasingly uncomfortable. I mean, I think I quoted from the briefing for the 11th of December committee about 40% of people currently with the virus who wouldn't be eligible because they were, they didn't have, as it were, a serious enough condition. So that was precisely the position that was making me increasingly uncomfortable, which was why in January we extended the reach of the scheme. So I can't say exactly how many people that would have covered, but it certainly, from my subsequent position, would not have been a large enough number or percentage of people.
I think then, if we just, for the sake of completeness, put up the letter of the 18th of December 2002 from you to Andrew Smith, and that's SCGV 40251_043. If we go over to the second page. So you say there, I understand that officials have had further discussions following my letter of the 5th of November. I thought it would be helpful to elaborate on the executive's thinking in terms of how a scheme may operate. And then you talk about preference for a scheme that would make ongoing payments to surviving patients triggered by progression to a stage of disease that could easily be linked to the concepts of need and suffering. We feel that such payments would be less likely to be perceived as compensation, and therefore as being a new departure from the principle that the NHS does not pay compensation when there is no legal liability. And then you say this, as you know, our preliminary view is that any scheme for making ex gratia payments to this group of patients would lie within devolved competence. However, I understand that there may be an argument that a scheme based on lump sum payments is less likely to be viewed as involving reserve powers than one based on ongoing payments. We believe that a lump sum payment scheme would also offer a workable approach to meeting the needs of this group of people. if it would help to address any concerns on devolved competence, we'd be willing to go forward on the basis that any new scheme would only involve lump sums. Is that the letter you were referring to?
Yes, I mean, because that was a key turning point. And paragraph 2 is actually quite interesting because I think the department all along felt we're worried about this. Well, we've talked about this before, but this idea that somehow we don't want it to appear as compensation if we give it as a lump sum, and then subsequently the argument became if we give it to everybody, it looks like compensation rather than as relieving suffering. So I think that is actually quite an interesting letter in terms of the thinking within the department that I was beginning to feel a bit uncomfortable about, because at the end of the day, I did accept these arguments about how it was a precedent, but in retrospect, they were probably overdone because it was possible to make ad hoc payments, I think, as it turned out, without it becoming, as far as I can see, an enormous precedent for lots of other groups of people. But they were genuinely concerns that people had at the time. So in understanding the thinking of the executive and similar thinking in the UK government, I think that is quite an important point.
And is it right to understand that this letter is showing that the executive's thinking about the lump sum payments was linked to this issue about whether or not it was devolved because of
well, that was what the shift. That was the reason why the shift was made at that time. But it also had the consequence, which in a kind of way was helpful from my point of view, that it shifted us nearer to the position of the expert group report. Obviously, it didn't get us into the same position because of all the amounts of awards payment issues that we've discussed in detail, but it got us onto the same territory as the expert group report, because we were then talking about lump sum payments. And so the question then just became how much they were to be and who was to get them. But it enabled us, in a sense, to get onto that expert group report in terms of the way we thought about it. So for me, although that was the trigger for it, it gets us into devolved territory. From my point of view, it also got us onto that territory where we could actually offer this as a lump sum payment and to more people.
Can we then turn to SCGV 40251_034? So this is a submission to the Cabinet for decision, and we've looked at this. This is in advance of your appearance at the Health and Community Care Committee on the 29th of January. It's what's said over at paragraph 2, about halfway down, that I'm asked to raise with you, and it relates to the point we've just been looking at. So we go to the second page. It's the paragraph that says lump sum awards are proposed underneath the 3 options. So whereas we looked in the last letter about the issue of lump sum awards being related to the question of whether or not the scheme was devolved, here we have something else in January 2003 being saying lump sum awards are proposed because we understand it might be easier for these to be disregarded for social security purposes. Had the Scottish Executive's thinking changed by January 2003 to considering it to be relevant to that point?
Well, I think it was helpful in 2 ways. The letter of the 18th of December was saying we thought it would be easier to have it accepted that it was within devolved competence. But I suppose it's kind of not surprising as well that a lump sum payment would, well, it's not necessarily the case, but perhaps this was also something we'd been told by the DWP, that if you're getting ongoing payments, it might, well, certainly we know that the Macfarlane Trust required to have legislation to ensure that they didn't affect social security payments. So we knew that that was the case. So there clearly was an issue with ongoing payments, and I suppose we either knew or were told that lump sum payments wouldn't have quite the same immediate effect on social security payments. So I think that's not entirely surprising, but we certainly know from the McFarlane Trust that ongoing payments required legislation to prevent them from having an effect on social security payments. And there was no guarantee at this stage, of course, that we would get such legislation from the UK government for what was at this stage an entirely Scottish scheme.
What efforts were made to try to explain the reasons why the Ross recommendations were not to be followed to the infected and affected community, or at least those representing them?
Well, obviously, more people could always have been talked to, but I certainly remember, in fact, I think I got asked a question about it, a very long meeting with the Haemophilia Society. Philip Dolan, I think, was the particular individual. A very long meeting, as I think you referenced in your question to me, which was partly about the public inquiry issue, but was equally about the amount of payments. So I think, no doubt it could have been discussed in other forums as well, and it was, but that's the one that's springing to mind. And obviously this was discussed very extensively in the public domain more generally, but yes, of course, more discussions could always have been held, and that's obviously the case.
Now, turning to your appearance before the Health and Community Care Committee on the 9th of September, I think in evidence today you suggested that the fact that the scheme by then was a UK scheme meant that the social security issue had been resolved. And the question is, why is that? Surely that would equally have been resolved if there had been separate schemes.
Well, I take the point there. I mean, obviously, the earlier point I was making, if it was only a Scottish scheme, that would have been a problem. Yes, if you'd had a separate Scottish, English, Welsh, Northern Ireland scheme, you would think that the social security issue could equally be resolved. Well, that's arguably the case, so I suppose I still think it was easier to resolve it if it was done on a UK basis, but I suppose the implication of that may be, why couldn't we have had a more generous scheme in Scotland than elsewhere? On the other hand, the amounts had already been announced for Scotland, so we weren't having to retreat from those amounts. And of course, the other point to make is there actually has proved no reason within the UK scheme why different countries couldn't subsequently award different amounts. So there's always an argument. Of course, I've accepted that it would have been desirable for more to be paid, but in fact, the fact it was a UK scheme didn't prevent different amounts being paid to different nations subsequently. So it worked at that time because we were all agreed that we were all paying the same. So why would we not have a UK scheme under those circumstances?
At the time that you appeared before that committee on the 9th of September, had the level of payments and the identity of those who would receive those payments been agreed with the UK government?
I think there were still some details about where the line should be drawn, but as you saw from an earlier document that you put on the screen, it was certainly before the 9th of September, there was reference there to the UK scheme already accepting the Scottish level of payments, including payments to those who had cleared the virus through treatment. So that had certainly been agreed. I think there was still a grey area about those who had cleared the virus without treatment.
You mentioned the fact that you'd made certain efforts to try and assist the infected with access to mortgages and insurance. What was the ultimate result of those attempts?
Well, I think there was some frustration about that. I mean, some of it was intrinsic to the powers that we had, because, of course, financial services is a reserved matter, and the Scottish Government had no direct ability to change policy in that area or force the financial services industry to do anything. So it was only a matter of persuasion and discussion, and we did have some, well, part of the summit that I held with them was partly to educate them and give them more knowledge about the nature of hepatitis C and what effect this might have on some of their decisions. And there were obviously concerns about unfair loading and why they were sometimes disqualified from all payments when, well, perhaps it was nothing to do with hepatitis C that was causing the illness and so on. In terms of getting undertakings from them, that was more challenging. I mean, they said they would ensure that, well, I think the other problem was that the main issue was insurance, and the insurance representative, the ABI representative at the summit wasn't the chief executive, let's put it that way. So he said he would go and strongly advise that they shouldn't be asking questions directly about hepatitis C. That continued for some time afterwards, but I think not for, as far as I know, for a very long period of time. But the other undertaking they made was to produce a fact sheet so that some of their practices were more open and explicit, because one of the issues that was being raised by the patient representatives at the summit was your official policy may be this, but sometimes you make decisions and you don't write them down. We just get this decision by phone and so on. So the representative undertook to go and produce a fact sheet, or I think he advised again because he wasn't the man in charge. So that was a very frustrating thing, because we kept pursuing this issue. Where's this fact sheet that you said you were going to give? And then that was made even more difficult, because I think he was called Graham Spittles. He was quite a senior representative of the ABI. He then moved to another job, so we couldn't use him anymore. And I know by the time I left office, which was, well, nearly 2 years afterwards, we were still pursuing this issue. And so it was very frustrating, partly because we were never going to be able to direct them because we didn't have the powers to do it. And secondly, because some of the undertakings they gave were certainly taking a long time to be resolved. But having said that, the patient representatives of the group did feel it had been a constructive meeting, and as far as I know, there were continued dialogue between those patient representatives and the financial services people. So it was a step forward, but yes, it was disappointing in terms of achieving the kind of breakthroughs that we would have wished for.
Does it follow from that, well, the question is, do you know whether any mortgage and insurance products were made available to the infected as a result of those efforts?
I don't know of any specific ones in terms of new products. I don't have that information. Whether that happened subsequently, I don't know.
We looked earlier at the recommendations of the Ross group. I took you to the non-financial recommendations: access to information on hepatitis C, counselling services, access to information on benefits, and so on. Were those non-financial recommendations taken forward? And if not, why not?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of activity. I mean, we haven't talked about that obviously today because we've been concentrating on the particular issue of infection through blood products. But from before the time that I was a minister, before the time I was in the Scottish Parliament even, I've certainly taken a very keen interest on wider support for people with hepatitis C. When I was still in the Westminster Parliament, I remember going to a meeting in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh with Professor Peter Hayes, which was talking about these wider issues, about the treatment of people with hepatitis C, about the prevention of hepatitis C, about support more widely for people with hepatitis C. And I had several meetings with the Edinburgh group, Capital C, who were also pushing on these issues. So I was actually more involved with wider hepatitis C issues than I was initially with the issue of contamination by blood products. And as in terms of the time when I was a minister, yes, well, we've set up, for example, a hepatitis C resource centre. There was a wide-ranging report by the Scottish Needs Assessment Programme, commonly called a SNAP report, which made great changes in terms of the treatment of hepatitis C and the prevention of hepatitis C, and there was a lot of activity by the Chief Medical Officer in terms of getting these the recommendations of that report implemented throughout the health service. And then, of course, we developed the synthetic blood products. I think Scotland was probably the only nation in the UK that was entirely able to use those, so that problems of contamination, in fact, weren't possible subsequently. So that also happened during my time as a minister. So I think there was a lot of activity, but I'm sure there are some areas where more could have been done. So I'm not saying that was perfect, but there was certainly an area to which we devoted a great deal of attention.
What discussions did you have with Andy Kerr about how the hepatitis C ex gratia fund would be paid for?
I don't think I had any discussions with Andy Kerr, well, not once the decision had been made, because it just had to come out of my health budget. So obviously, before the decision was made, the issue of where it was just always assumed it was coming from the health budget, and indeed, as I said earlier, it's never come from anywhere else in all the years that have passed since. So in that sense, it wasn't really a subject up for discussion. It was just always assumed that it was going to come from the health budget, and once it was a matter of the health budget, I could obviously spend the health budget as I saw fit.
I took you to some documents and asked you some questions about what was said about the position in Ireland. Who was the main civil servant who was giving you information about the Irish situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you saw his name on the documents that you put on the screen, and there may well have been other servants. So I would be reluctant to name one rather than two or three individuals. I think it would be fairer to say that the civil servants that I list in my written statement were the ones who gave me advice in general, and I think the document that you put on the screen gave the name of the particular civil servant who gave the advice to which you were discussing then.
So those are the questions from call participants that I am going to ask. No questions from Mr. Chisholm's legal representatives.
Well, I have no questions of my own.
Mr. Chisholm, is there anything that you would like to say?
Well, I mean, I would firstly like to apologise for speaking too quickly at the beginning. I hope I had slowed down, and obviously I was very pleased to be speaking in a sense on World Hepatitis Day, because obviously it made us think even more about the condition. And I think some of the things I would say in conclusion I've said already. I mean, I'm obviously pleased that we set the ball rolling in terms of the level of payments, but I think I've explained the reasons why I couldn't offer more. I obviously regret very much that I didn't offer more, and I expect that many people will not really, why should they accept the reasons that I gave for that? But they were genuine reasons at the time, so I obviously have mixed feelings that on the one hand I'm pleased that I set the ball rolling, but I do regret obviously that the payments weren't larger. On the second major issue of the public inquiry, I tried to give the thinking that we had at the time. That's the main reason why I'm here today, to explain what we thought and why we made decisions at the time. But I fully accept, and I don't need to say that in present company, that there are many issues that do bear scrutiny in terms of things, aspects that could have been done differently. So I certainly look forward eagerly to the conclusions that you come to in due course about that. And as I said before, and as I said at the end of my written statement, I take full responsibility for any lack of understanding that I had of people affected and infected by hepatitis C in the conditions that we've described. I tried to have understanding and empathy, but clearly I, like everybody else, no doubt, could have had more, and I take full responsibility for any lack of understanding that I have, and I wish not just the inquiry well, but in particular the people still affected and infected by hepatitis C well in the future as well.
Well, if it's any comfort to you, I have ascribed the speed at which you've answered and spoken pretty much throughout, actually, I hope you don't mind my saying, to your enthusiasm and keenness to make sure that we had in your answers a long and full description of what you were able to offer us. And I'd just like to thank you very much for all that and for your time.
Thank you very much.
So tomorrow we hear the evidence of Susan Deacon.
Susan Deacon, tomorrow, 10 o'clock. She's in person, is she?
She's in person, she is.